Nadia, can I ask you, where does it stand at the moment? At this
At the moment, oh, is it too close to me? Is it too close to me? Better? Yeah. At the moment, it stands in the exact same place as it stood yesterday around this time, which is good. Which means that all three countries. Oh, I think it's this. Yeah. Here, do this. Look at this.
And without further ado, let me introduce our speakers today. We're joined by Consuls General Nadia Theodore from Canada and Javier Díaz de León from Mexico, here today to talk about trade. We also have former Atlanta Fed President and CEO Dennis Lockhart to help us moderate the conversation. A little bit about each of our speakers. Nadia has had an accomplished career as a trade negotiator, holding senior leadership positions on several recent and major trade initiatives for Canada, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Canadian-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. She also has served with the World Trade Organization, the United Nations. Her appointment as Consul General coincided with Canada, Mexico, and U.S. negotiations to modernize NAFTA. And so she's got a lot of experience and a lot of exposure to trade. What a perfect time to have her. Javier has been a member of the Foreign Service since 1991. He's held the rank of ambassador since April 2017. During his career, he's held multiple positions around the U.S., including Deputy Consul General in San Diego and New York, Office of Migratory and Hispanic Affairs in the Embassy of Mexico, and Executive Director of the Institute of Mexican Abroad of the Foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Mexico City. He's been Consul General he served as Consul General of Mexico in Atlanta since May 2016, and we're very happy to have him here with us today. I've had the pleasure of meeting Javier and Nadia at a previous event. They speak together often, and they're wonderful. So I'm really pleased to have you both. And last but not least, Dennis. As I said, he's the former Atlanta Fed president. I had the great pleasure of working with him during his tenure at the Atlanta Fed, and I'm very happy to have him back with us here today. Dennis is currently a distinguished professor of practice at the Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech, teaching courses on foreign policy. He's serving on several nonprofit boards, and he chairs Emory's Brain Health Center Advisory Council. Before becoming a central banker, he was a member of Georgetown's faculty, where he taught in global commerce and finance and international business government relations. All of that to say, Dennis has a lot of international experience, and we thought he'd be the perfect person to moderate this conversation. Without further ado, if I could please invite my esteemed guest up to the stage. And Dennis, I'll turn it over to you.
For that introduction, I'm sure Nadia and Javier, thank you as well. Let me congratulate the Economic Club of Atlanta for your precise prediction of the timing of this event. Now, I imagine the meeting several months ago where probably you, Jessica, said, well, on December 11th, the thing will be wrapped up. They will have had a ceremony in Mexico City a day or two before, and the newspaper will be covered with articles of how in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans were finally able to get together on something. I'm sure that's the way the meeting went, right? So congratulations, you really nailed this one. So there couldn't be a more timely topic than the USMCA and what it will mean to Canada, what it will mean to Mexico, what it will mean to the United States, and to the North American economy overall. I'm going to ask Javier and Nadia to really do two things. I'll ask you questions so you can speak from the perspective of your country and the interests of your country, but also as two people who have been following this so closely, to really sometimes step back and just talk generally about what's in the agreement, whether it affects your particular interests or not. So let's just start. I'm sure that there's probably one or two people in the audience who haven't gotten the 11:45 update on exactly where the approvals stand and what process is required from here out. But Nadia, can I ask you, where does it stand at the moment? At this
At the
minute?
moment, oh, is it too close to me? Is it too close to me? Better? Yeah. At the moment, it stands in the exact same place as it stood yesterday around this time, which is good. Which means that all three countries. Oh, I think it's this. Yeah. Here, do this. That works. Yeah. On verra. Yes, so all three countries have signed the agreement, the USMCA for folks here in the United States, the CUSMA, CUSMA for folks in Canada, and the TMAC for our friends in Mexico. So we were all in Mexico City yesterday, all three of our countries, and we signed off on the agreement and on some important changes that all three countries agreed would make the USMCA even better than it was, in 2018 when we signed it the first time.
Javier, what were some of the last minute details? What were the last minute changes that had to be made?
Well, a lot of people here in the room might remember that almost exactly a year ago, our respective leaders got together within in the framework of the G8 summit in Buenos Aires, and that was when the USMCA, the main document, was signed by President Trump, by Prime Minister Trudeau, and the then Mexican President Peña Nieto. So we had signed this a year ago. After that, the review and legislative ratification process started in all three countries. In the case of Mexico, Mexico did its work, and we got it through our Congress and our Senate in Mexico halfway through the year. But of course, this is something that's been going on and was the subject of a lot of discussion in the United States and Canada, particularly, of course, in the House of Representatives. So a lot of conversations came and went between, of course, the administration, the White House, and of course, Canadian and Mexican officials talking to the leadership, the Democratic leadership in the House of Representatives about some of their concerns about some elements that, in their opinion, needed to be included in the agreement. So that opened the need for what we call a additional protocol, a side document that was exactly what was agreed upon yesterday and signed yesterday in Mexico City.
Talk about an industry that is, I think, prominent in the agreement, and everyone has a big interest in autos, the autos. So can each of you speak from your country's perspective about the provisions in the agreement, what you think is most important? And I'd like to explore a little bit whether this agreement sort of reflects a zero-sum game. That is, if American workers in the United States win, will Canadian workers or Mexican workers lose? So, Javier, why don't you get us started?
I'll start by the last assertion you just made. The answer is a simple no. It is not a zero-sum game, and we've been talking about this for months and months in several events and everywhere we talk about it, because the thing to always understand about what's been part of the story of our manufacturing process, particularly in the auto industry, since NAFTA came into being, is that we have become a manufacturing platform, a supply chain manufacturing platform at the regional level. So, for example, there is no such thing as a Mexican car or a Canadian car or a Mexican car. We estimate that at least during a car is manufactured, a car crosses the border at least 8 times. Out of every Mexican export to anywhere in the world, 40% of that export is 40% of that export is U.S. content. So this is a supply chain that comes and goes between our countries. So and we have become the most competitive manufacturing region in the world, particularly among other things, but particularly in the auto industry. And plants that operate here in the United States, for example, I can tell you about, for example, plants in this region, car plants in Georgia or in Alabama. A few months ago, I was in Huntsville, Alabama, talking with people from the Toyota plant in Alabama, and they were telling me about how they manufacture thousands of engines, car engines, that travel from Alabama to Tijuana, Mexico, to the Toyota plant in Tijuana, Mexico, for the assembly of a car. So that means that this supply chain is, and the transfer of goods, in this case from Alabama to Mexico, and of course from Mexico to Alabama, among other plants, Kia plant in Monterrey and the Kia plants here in Georgia, need to happen, need to be efficient, and need to be competitive. And so it's not like Georgia and Monterrey or Alabama and Tijuana are competing for the business of making cars. Toyota has this very, very, very well placed, and Kia and mostly any other car manufacturer that you think of, because that's the strategic and the most efficient way for them to make cars.
And one more question: the labor provision requires $16 an hour pay is going to be raising the wages for Mexican workers in the auto industry?
Well, that's probably the most innovative element of the new agreement in compared to NAFTA, particularly regarding the car industry. There is a provision effectively in the sense that at least between 40 and 45% of the cars that are manufactured in North America need to be manufactured in a place where wages are at least $16 an hour. Now there's a wait time for that to happen. If I remember right, it's about a little bit over 10 years for that to happen. So Mexico needs to, but and it's very important to understand also that Mexico does not and did not and will not base its competitive platform on low wages. We very well understand, and Mexico very much understands that the way that we are preparing our economy to be competitive in the world has to be based on manufacturing efficiency, logistics, all the other things, and not based on low wages. And that is something that all our three countries agreed upon, and it's one of the elements that are there.
I'll come back to you in a moment, because one of the features of this, at least from the U.S. perspective, is labor reform in Mexico. But Nadia, staying on autos, local North American content, there's a threshold that has to be met. Steel was thrown into this question just in the last 2 weeks about where the steel would be sourced. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, happy to. But let me just take a step back maybe first and talk about, because Javier answered it so eloquently just a minute ago, and I want us to actually take a minute to reflect on what Javier said in response to your question about whether trade is a zero-sum game, because I think it's really important. This idea of Canada, Mexico, and the United States, as Javier very rightly so said, being a source together of North American production that in a globalized world actually makes things together. So there is no, as Javier said, Mexican car, American car, or Canadian car, and then exports that North American product out to the world is something that I think we all say, right? Or maybe just the trade nerds say, but we all as business people say it, but sometimes we actually don't take the time to reflect on what that actually means. In practice, it means, and some of you, I ran out of fact sheets, but some of you have fact sheets on your table there. In practice, what Canada and the United States, I'll speak for Canada and the United States in particular, what we export and import to each other is much of the same types of products. And the reason why we have been able, so if you look at I think the back inside sheet, you'll see exports and imports, very much similar products. And the reason that we have been able to thrive as a North American as a North American continent to compete against Europe, against Asia, and win most of the time is because of those very figures. Because we have created these supply chains, another buzzword that we all use, these supply chains that allow us to produce things most efficiently in each other's markets, and then assemble them in one of our three markets, depending on, a myriad of factors, wages being one of them, but only one of a myriad of factors, and then sell them to our consumers in our countries for a price that people are willing to pay, and then sell them abroad globally out in the world for a price that folks out there are willing to pay, over and above what they're willing to pay from companies that are in Europe or in Asia, etc. That has allowed us to thrive as a North American platform, as Javier said. So I just wanted to take a moment to reflect on that, because I think it actually also leads very nicely into the discussion of what happened in the autos negotiations. And so, during the original NAFTA, when we negotiated the regional value content for autos, which is the percentage of the car that needs to be made in Canada, the United States, or Mexico in order to get the preferential tariff treatment, right? In order to get that golden 0% tariff that allows us to price our cars rightly and most efficiently. The regional value content at that time was 62.5%. So it meant that when you added up all the parts of a car, 62.5% of all of those parts in a car needed to be made in either Canada, the United States, or Mexico in order to have that 0% tariff, right? Great. At the time, that 62.5% tariff, regional value content requirement, was the highest of any trade agreement ever negotiated, and remained the highest of any trade agreement that has ever been negotiated ever since. And so in practice, what that meant was that from the time that it was signed up until today, Canada, the United States, and Mexico have created an environment where outsiders that don't have any of the obligations of the agreement also don't get any of the benefits, right? So 62.5% of that car needs to be made within the region of these three partners. Great. Well, as things evolve, as companies get smart, as, supply chains shift and wiggle, and do their thing, over the years, we, as I would say, as a trilateral group, noticed that there were a few loopholes, right? So this 62.5% of regional value content was in place and was working fairly well, but in some instances, it wasn't working that well. And the way that supply chains and globalization has occurred over the past 25 years meant that, and the United States in particular, noticed that, there was a lot of non-North American stuff ending up in our cars. And the United States administration in particular really and truly believed that this was displacing well-paying jobs here in the United States and sending them elsewhere. And so they wanted to tighten up those rules of origin, that regional value content requirement that would allow for the preferential treatment for an automobile. And so we did that, right? And so now we have moved under this new agreement from a 62.5% regional value content to a 70% regional value content requirement. Still the highest in any trade agreement ever negotiated, and I would hazard a guess will be for a very long time, because as business people, we're going to have a little bit of real talk here, right? I mean, because we're all supposed to say that it's the best thing since sliced bread and all the rest of it, and it is. It's a good agreement, and I believe in it, and I'm a trade policy person, and I believe in trade, and I believe in trade agreements. But the reality is that as business people, for those of you who in the room who are business people, work for either big businesses or small business owners, you know that the ability to source pieces in order to make an end product at a price that allows you to actually stay competitive is important, right? And absolutely 100% when you can, you source those from the closest to you, right? You save on logistics costs, you save on transportation costs. It's great to be able to buy your part down the street or just across the border in Mexico or Canada. But the ability to source parts elsewhere now and again is also important in order for companies to maintain their competitiveness, right? Right. And are kept at bay in the future. Yeah, my favorite.
Entirely different question. In North America, we don't have a monetary union. So you still have the peso, Canadian dollar, US dollar. Did currency provisions get into this agreement? Is there anything in it? It's what, 2,082 pages, I think, something like that. Did it touch on the touchy issue of currency movements?
Well, first of all, I would lie to you if I told you that I've read the 2,000 pages. I haven't. But I can tell you, and there's a real expert here that can probably guide us in the right direction, but I can tell you that, to my knowledge, not in NAFTA or mostly in most trade agreements, currency issues are not part of those sort of agreements. Now, it's not really an issue that our countries discussed in the framework of a trade negotiation, because basically our three countries operate on the basis of a floating currency. And there's no such thing. All our three countries have central banks or central monetary institutions, like the Fed in the case of the United States. Mexico has a independent central bank that is not dependent on the executive or anything like that. It has a floating currency. So the value of the Mexican peso is not determined by the government. It's determined by the market. I'm pretty sure it's the same case of the Canadian dollar. So it's really not an issue at all, and was never part of the discussion.
Labor reform, what was that set of issues all about?
Yeah, I mean, labor reform, of course. I mean, one of the concerns that we saw from the other sides of the table during the conversations around the new trade agreement, of course, was this gap on the issue of labor conditions and labor production and perceptions of certain production sectors in the United States of unfair competition coming from the south of the border because of low wages or unfair labor practices in Mexico. All that was part of the conversations there. So a lot of those things needed to be reviewed and seen. Mexico, as all of you might know, changes administration. We have a new government that came into power exactly 1 year ago also. And so since that happened, Mexico underwent a very, very important and very profound labor reform in our laws in Mexico. And Mexico approved a new labor reform that, among other things, established conditions for things like collective bargaining, to guarantee free association for workers. Because, I mean, there's always been, I was reading or hearing somewhere this morning, that some people think that this agreement involves that Mexico has now approved unions. No, Mexico has had unions for decades and decades. This is not something new in Mexico. What has been happening, what happened in Mexico for a lot of years, is that unions became centralized, and they became part of a very, connected part of the governing structure connected to political parties. And there was a certain suspicion that there wasn't enough freedom for workers to freely unionize, outside of these very old institutions, old union institutions that are connected to old party government structures in the country. So that was what a lot was about this labor reform happened in Mexico. If I remember right, around the summer, June or July this year, it was approved by the Mexican Congress. So we did our work in our Congress in Mexico. Now, the real concern that came after that, in terms of the conversations that were happening in Washington and in Ottawa and in Mexico City during the past few weeks, was mostly a concern, particularly from the House of Representatives, about enforcement. So it's not really whether Mexico has the laws or the framework in place for a much more fairer and a good and a better labor environment. It's how is it enforced? And there was a demand in the conversations up until the last few days that Mexico insisted and said constantly that we felt was basically inadmissible. And there was a demand from the American part that Mexico should accept U.S. inspectors to come into Mexico and visit, working places to determine whether Mexico was abiding by its own laws. So you can probably imagine. So we said, okay, let's have Mexican inspectors come to the United States and judge whether you are, abiding your laws. That's a non-starter. And that dragged on for a long time. And in the end, what we came with is how do we resolve disputes? And this is not a new thing. I mean, NAFTA had a dispute solving mechanism, which is a common practice in international trade, which is establishing international panels, expert panels, to review issues and to determine whether some country is not following the rules. That was set up in NAFTA. So we set up in this case in the new USMCA is a specific procedure for panels of expert panels to be placed to review labor issues in our three countries. These panels are smaller panels. These are panels composed of 3 people. The general panels of the rest of the big agreement are usually 5 people. These are 3 people. In this case, for example, if the dispute is between the United States and Mexico, it would have to be, of course, an American person, a Mexican person, and someone from somewhere else, maybe Canadian, German, I don't know. And the other thing to say is that the way it works is that the United States sets up a list of experts that is there. They decide who are these experts that they consider are people who would be part potentially of these labor panels. Mexico creates its own list too. Mexico chooses from the American list who the American panelists will be, and the US chooses from the Mexican list who the Mexican expert will be. And we together determine who the third one, neutral panelist, will be. And it's also considered to be, and it's also set up to be a much faster process that should take about 85 days at the most for it to determine whether something's happening. So that's the way we solved the issue. Other issues that were on the table, of course, was, for example, the demand for these panels or these revisions to take place generally in the case of any labor issue in Mexico. Mexico said, yes, as long as it's related to trade. Things, companies, production processes that are related to trade among us, then it means that it's jurisdiction of our agreement. There was pressure to take that out. They wanted jurisdiction over everything that happens in Mexico. No. So what we ended up is, yes, issues related, practices that are, of concern, that might be of concern, related to trade, and that are recurrent. That's the other thing. Not one time, but there is recurrency of a practice of something going on. Then we go and we detonate this mechanism to give more certainty about how we are going to enforce these labor laws.
You anticipated one of my questions on dispute resolution. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Thank you for covering that. A couple more questions from me, and then we'll go to the audience. But talk a little bit about dairy. It's been a fairly arcane, but rather intense area of contention. And Canada has been the protector of an industry. Can you talk about how that played out in the agreement?
Absolutely. Let me just say one thing before I move to dairy. On currency manipulation, just to say and to underscore what Javier said, that the idea of currency and currency manipulation and balance of payments and macroeconomic policy is really the stuff that has never, as you rightly said, Javier, never been dealt with in a trade agreement before. Over the past several years, there has been amongst the international trading community a little bit of a realization that these factors, macroeconomic policies of countries, actually does affect trade, right? I mean, we knew that intuitively, but it has gotten very stark in the past several years. And so in the new USMCA, for the first time ever, there is actually a chapter on macroeconomic policies. And it really is just a requirement for all three countries. First, it's a reaffirmation that all three countries, as Javier rightly said, agree and commit to having their currency pegged by the market and not by governments, right? And also a requirement by all three countries to report monthly on balance of payment figures and certain macroeconomic policy figures through the IMF. So, but it is significant because there has never been a chapter on macroeconomic policy in a free trade agreement ever before. This is the first time ever. And it's significant in the sense that, for Canada, the United States, and Mexico to agree that this is important enough to actually have some obligations in a trade agreement is a step forward and is something that the rest of the world can look at, understanding that when they are ready, when they are trading and when they're working within the global trading system, macroeconomic policy is a factor that does affect trade flows, right? So I just wanted to put that out there. Dairy, my favorite topic, because I love to state some facts around dairy. Some little known facts. So did you know, because I noticed that my dear friend Dennis prefaced his question by saying Canada is a protector of an industry. So did you know that the United States exports a lot of dairy, right? A lot of dairy, a lot of eggs, a lot of chicken, right? Chicken and eggs in particular here in Georgia. Who can guess what their top export market is? Who can guess? Who is the United States' top export market for dairy? Oh, no. Guess again. Yeah, I'll give it to you. Canada. Canada is the number 2 export market for the United States in dairy products. So I have to say that, and I say this with love in my heart, that it gets me very excited when people say to me that Canada is protecting our dairy market vis-a-vis the United States in particular. Because if we are doing a very lousy job because you export all of your dairy to us, right?
Not very good at it.
We're not very good at it. So I will put that out there as a fact. So number 2, I will say that much like what the United States does with their sugar market, with their sugar industry, and a little bit with their dairy industry, actually, we don't in Canada actually subsidize our dairy industry, unlike the United States, which subsidizes your dairy industry, and also has certain price controls around dairy. We control production in Canada, right? And, Canada and the United States have a very close family-like relationship. And all of us here have families, right? And you know that in a family, usually the arguments aren't really around you know, the existential policy or value judgments, right? Usually in a family, we all share the same values, right? We're all family, we're friends, we share the same values, we want the same things, we're driving towards the same objectives. But oftentimes in a family, there are disagreements as to how best to operationalize those values and those existential questions, right? And I would say that protection of certain industries, sugar and tobacco in the United States as an example, dairy in Canada, even intellectual property, which we can talk about a little bit if you like, is one of those, is like that vis-a-vis Canada and the United States. So, you know, where Canada has decided not to subsidize our dairy industry and not to control pricing like the United States does, we do control production. And in response to that, we also are not allowed to, or have very tight restrictions on what we are allowed to export out of Canada vis-a-vis our dairy market, right? So that's the quid pro quo, so to speak, right? So we have certain fences around our dairy industry, around our supply managing the supply, the production. And therefore, we have restrictions on how we export those products. And so, like you very rightly said, Dennis, it has been a long-standing argument between Canada and the United States, and many other countries, actually, to be very fair. New Zealand and Australia in particular, who used to have a supply managed system and dismantled it several years ago, you know, never loses the opportunity to tell us how we should be doing the same and how it's, you know, revolutionized their economy and what are we waiting for. And so in the context of trade agreements, we provide access to countries for small portions of our dairy market. So in the case of the United States, under NAFTA, we actually provided what we call tariff rate quotas. So we carve out a section of our industry or an amount of product that the United States, in this case, is allowed, and Mexico, is allowed to export to Canada duty-free, tariff-free, with no tariff, right? And once you reach that threshold, which the United States has never reached, by the way, so they've never actually reached the top of the amount that they're allowed to export. Once you reach that threshold, then the tariff is exorbitant, right? Over 200%, absolutely. Much like your 152% tariff on paper clips, or your 196% tariff, I believe, on tobacco, or your tariff rate quota on sugar. So all of these, right, we all have them. So mea culpa, you a culpa, everybody culpa. In the new USMCA, the United States requested more access at that 0% tariff rate for dairy, for poultry, for eggs, for yogurt, for, you know, lots of different supply managed products, lots of dairy products. And we provided the United States with 3.6% more access to our dairy market than before. So that is an additional benefit that the United States gets to be able to export dairy to Canada. Poultry and eggs, we did the same thing. So poultry is, it's not a percentage, it's a metric ton, and I can't remember the number, 35,000 metric ton. Don't quote me on the number, but a little bit over, more access for poultry, more access for eggs as well. In return, Canada also requested a little bit more access over that quota for sugar, because like I said, we do dairy, you do sugar, and we got more access for our sugar market into the United States as well. But you know, you're right. It has been a contentious issue from time immemorial. We love to argue over it. We love to not present the facts around it because, you know, it makes it juicier. But the reality is that the United States does have access to the Canadian dairy market. You export most of your dairy to Canada and no other country. And now under the new USMCA, you will be you will have room to grow, in fact. So there will be growth potential for your dairy farmers to export even more to Canada should they so wish.
NAFTA had a life of what, 25 years? And this one, there's a 16-year life, but after 6 years, one of the objectives of this whole process was to modernize the North American trade arrangements. So I want you to reflect on whether you think this agreement is going to be durable and that it is going to be address the right questions and be appropriate in the context of trends that are going on in trade on a global basis. And in preparing for this, I looked at a McKinsey study that was published in January of this year. And here are a couple of the key points from that study. Declining trade intensity in goods, in goods producing value chains is a global trend. A large and rising role of services, which brings the question of intellectual property into play. Growing knowledge intensiveness in supply chains, logistics, and therefore trade flows. Low-skill labor becoming less important as a factor of production. You've already commented on this, Javier. Labor cost arbitrage, much less important in world trade. And a shift from global supply chains to regional and domestic supply chains. So if you take those points as a context, do you think this agreement is going to stand up to those trends for the next 16 or 22 years?
I would say that it puts us in a better position to adapt to new conditions, particularly the last of those elements that you mentioned, Dennis, regarding to the rising importance of regional supply chains, which is exactly what we're talking about here. What we are seeing right now, mostly around the world, is the global supply chain structure is kind of not so global anymore, and manufacturers and investors are looking for certainty, and certainty among regional certainty looks to be the future. And in that sense, I don't see any region in the world that has the strength and the certainty that we now have in North America in other parts of the world. There's no such certainty in Asia. There's certainly no such certainty in Europe or in other parts of the world. So North America, with this, is placed again in the most advantageous position because we are sending out a signal to investors and to manufacturers that this region is set up to manufacture with certainty for the future. That being said, also in terms of certainty, you also said what we have now is an agreement that has a sunset clause, and it involves, among other things, one of the things that NAFTA did not have was a setup of how do we review our agreement, how do we make sure that we are doing this right, how can we tweak it and tighten some bolts in the machine. Well, now we have a mechanism to do it. We didn't have it before. And now this agreement establishes a review every 6 years, which we will sit down every 6 years to see how we're doing. Is this working well or not? Do we need to adjust this or not? Blah, blah. And every 6 years we will review and we'll see what we need to fix. If 6 years from now we are, we determine that this is broken, this is a zombie and we can't do anything about it, I don't see why it's going to happen. If we did that, 6 years from now, then it has at least a 16-year threshold in order for it to happen. That means, among other things, that this goes beyond specific political administrations in all three countries. This is, and NAFTA had basically a standard provision that any country could get out of it with a relatively short period of time. So it could be a decision of any government in Canada, in the United States, or Mexico to decide to get out of it. In this case, with this thing about 16 years and a 6-year review enforced in there, it means basically, if you consider the political, Canada is a little different because of parliamentary democracy, of course, but in the case of the United States and Mexico, this involves at least 2 administrations in Mexico. And this involves more than that in the United States.
Same question, and then we'll go to the audience.
Yeah, I agree with Javier. And you know, I think that maybe taking it up maybe a thousand feet or so, I think that when you talk about whether a trade agreement or whether a region of the world is best positioned to take us into the 21st century, to me there are kind of 3, and one of them Javier already touched on, this constant review. And on that, you know, what's important to note is that at the 6-year review mark, if a country, at that 6-year review mark, each country has to, in writing, say whether or not it agrees to renew the agreement for another 16 years, okay? At that 6-year review mark. At that 6-year review mark, if one country doesn't want to put that in writing, it automatically triggers a yearly review for the duration of the 16 years that the agreement is in force. And I note that importantly because I think that the single most thing that we have learned from this NAFTA renegotiation or modernization is the ability for countries to keep talking. The ability of countries to actually find things that they hold in common, find the value systems that all 3, in our case, all 3 of us are looking to achieve, and then striving to achieve those and operationalize those through constant communication. That is why we are where we are right now today. Even in, I mean, let's not, the elephant in the room is, you know, our 3 countries are very differently politically. And in the case of Canada and the United States, perhaps most differently politically than we have been in a very long time, right? And the fact that we have been able to conclude this agreement, all 3 of us, speaks to the importance of understanding that the value of a North American relationship, the value of those North American supply chains is, and excuse, you know, the kind of saying, the catchphrase, too big to fail. Too big to fail. So in my view, absolutely the USMCA takes us into the future. We can talk about services. There is a chapter, a cross-border trade and services chapter in the USMCA, as there was in the North American Free Trade Agreement. It seeks to ensure that companies are treated fairly in all three countries. It has a non-binding, mind you, but an agreement that encourages countries to mutually recognize our professionals across all 3 countries, because as you rightly said, Dennis, that is the wave of the future. Services, people, business people, not any old people, business people crossing borders to do business. How do we facilitate that? We're not talking about migration or irregular migration. We're talking about business people. IBM Canada sending over people to IBM USA to learn about the latest technology or vice versa, right? So all of those things are addressed in the USMCA and will ensure that we move into the future. And then the third thing that I just wanted to touch on is this idea as well that I can't remember if it was Dennis or Javier mentioned, the idea of the change in work, right? This idea of low-skilled work being moved, changing, right? The future of work, as we call it now, that's the buzzword for it. You know, what people often forget when we talk about NAFTA and this idea of the textile industry and the auto industry moving away and going somewhere else, is the fact that those low-skilled jobs were replaced by higher paying, greater skills requirement jobs, right? And so now the plants in South Carolina, the DecoStar plant here in Carrollton, Georgia, which employs just as many people across the United States as it does in Canada, by the way. Those are all now jobs that pay $16 an hour or more, as opposed to, the $5 an hour that it used to pay. And so that's important to realize too, as we talk about trade and how trade is going to be relevant for the future. We need to understand that setting our countries up to be able to take advantage of the high-skilled work that will come out of a more globalized or regionalized society, or the way that the future of work is moving, automation, etc. That to me is the value of creating a regional, a North American region. The fact that we are able to drive those efficiencies and drive those higher skilled, better paying jobs into our region for the betterment of all three countries and the citizens within it.
Time for one or two questions, you think? Yes, sir.
Yes. Lumber, yes. Knew it was coming. Yes. Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. So lumber was never dealt with in the North American Free Trade Agreement. It was a 10-year agreement that expired. Now, I keep on losing track. I've been here 3 years, so it expired 4 years ago. And that softwood lumber agreement really spoke to that very issue that you're talking about. And again, it goes to this whole, you say potato, I say potato. So the way that the United States and Canada supports their lumber industry, we both support our lumber industry. We do it in different ways, right? The United States postulates that the way that Canada does it leads to dumping. Canada actually postulates that the way that the United States does it leads to dumping on the other side of the border, So we had a softwood lumber agreement that we negotiated that regulated the trade amongst our two countries. It has expired, and the United States has actually placed tariffs on Canadian lumber. And until that is resolved, the tariffs, I believe, will remain in place to the detriment of U.S. consumers, and that's not world according to Nadia, that's world according to the homeowners, the National Homeowners Association, even some of the lumber, not the lumber producers, but the lumber, what do you do with lumber? Distributors, thank you. The lumber distributors, all of them have noticed the increase in prices actually since the tariffs have been on. That have increased the prices of housing, the prices of construction generally. So it's unfortunate, and you're right. It is a time immemorial, almost as long as dairy, argument between Canada and the United States. Not regulated by the NAFTA though, regulated by a separate agreement which has expired, and we have not. We unfortunately have not been able to renegotiate successfully. So fingers crossed.
Question? Yes. I came here to ask questions, not to answer questions. I used to have to answer questions all the time. Javier, is it a watershed event? Is it a major turning point for the North American continent?
I think for us, it's we wouldn't agree with the assertion that we now have something instead of the worst trade agreement in history. I think we think that NAFTA was not perfect. It needed to be updated. It needed to be fixed. And this is better because it addresses a lot of the issues that we discussed. In the end, I think, like I tried to say before, I think it's a lot better. It's a very good, particularly because it will provide, as soon as it's ratified by the U.S. and Canada, And by the way, the Mexican Senate is going to need to review it because this is additional from what Mexico had approved. So this additional protocol will need to go back to the Mexican Senate. We think that will happen next week, and the Mexican. But once all that is done and we have the treaty in place, then it provides certainty. And that is something that you can probably imagine that nowadays in the current political, economic environment in the world, certainty is not a small thing. And we have certainty in North America. I can't say the same for most of the other large economies in the world. And if that's something that is watershed, I don't know if that's the adjective that could be used, but I think it's very important.